Hi, everybody. This is Andrew. If you're like me, you're on, I guess, quarantine, self-isolation, social distancing, or whatever, because of the COVID-19 thing going on. So I figure this is a great opportunity for me just to finally get caught up on tasting some of my whiskeys that I've been collecting over the years. I put out a quick question, see if anybody would be interested in seeing and maybe learning a little bit about whiskey while I do it. And I got a few answers saying yeah, so I'll go ahead and film these like every day, or every other day, depending on what I'm feeling like having a dram, and go from there. So I guess the first thing to go with that most people ask is, well, what is whiskey? You hear names like bourbon, Scotch, um, uh, regular whiskey, Tennessee whiskey, like what's the difference between them all? So first of all, Scotch is a uh, distilled spirit made from grain, typically made with grains like barley, corn, in some cases even oats, rye, and in some really weird instances, some stuff like quinoa and triticale, which is kind of fun. But essentially, you make a unfinished beer out of those types of grains, and you flash distill it, and you collect those vapors. It's a very, very high alcohol content at that point, and it's in its raw form something like moonshine, where it's clear, very, very strong, doesn't have a whole lot of flavor to it, and so it gets the flavor by being aged in a barrel, typically made with oak, and sometimes it'll be finished with stuff like wines, heavy ports, sherries, and that helps infuse that character into it. So as it ages over time, it starts to pick up the flavors, the smells, and the colors of whatever it's stored in, which is pretty fun. So I guess what I have most of, I think I did a count, I've got something like 37, 38 different types of whiskeys, and most of them are Scotch. And so Scotch whiskey is a Scottish whiskey that has a few rules to make it Scotch, and so it has to be made in Scotland, has to be stored in an oak barrel, and it has to be aged for over a period of at least 3 years to be considered Scotch. So they're a little they're pretty tight on the rules. That didn't sound good. Anyways, so you might hear some people saying, well, whiskey is whiskey, right? Like, why on God's green earth would there be so many different types of whiskeys? They all taste the same, they all taste terrible. And that's flat out wrong. I'll just come out and say that. So in Scotland itself, there's some pretty distinct regions where they make their whiskey that have a really unique character to it. Think of it almost like having a can of Coca-Cola versus a can of Sprite. They're both soda, they're both made in the same area, same factory even, but they taste completely different. So that's kind of where I want to start with. So the first one that I want to have is a lowland whiskey. And so that's a region like in the south part of Scotland, if you can imagine. It's kind of like the hat sitting on top of England. And this is an area that's known for making very smooth, very floral, kind of sweet, not too heavy whiskeys that are a great entry point that I think for anybody that would be interested in trying it that haven't really tried whiskey or any strong spirits before. And then it can range drastically to like the Ron Swanson Manly Man like smokiness, like Lagavulin you might have heard, which is like a really famous one that came out with Parks and Rec. So I'll go through that one also. I think I'll sample that one today because I'm feeling a little saucy. But yeah. So going forward, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce you to like the different facets of like the tasting that I'll do. I'll put some stuff like in the notes down below in the post, so that way you can kind of read up on some of the notes, and then moving forward, I can just kind of jump into it. So we'll go from there. So if you want to really like start like tasting, appreciating Scotch, you can start with the glass that you're going to do it out of. So these are little Glencairns. I have a slightly bigger one that's already prepared. But you notice they got kind of a funny shape. So the bulb and the taper, it's kind of like a wine glass where the whiskey smells and the vapors collect and they get funneled up into your nose, so you're able to smell them a little bit better. You don't need it necessarily, but you look extra pretentious and you look like you know what you're talking about when you're making a video to all 5 of you who are going to watch this. So bonus points for me. So the first thing that we're going to do when I'm going to be doing these tastings is I'm going to take a look at the color. I'm going to swirl around and take a look at the legs to see, it'll tell you how strong the alcohol is. And then we'll do the nose, and then we'll do the tasting. And so that'll be fun. I think anyway. I mean, I'll obviously tell you what the name of the distillery is, what the whiskey is, so that way you can, if in some oddball chance you're out and about after this all blows over, or if you have some at home, you can give it a try. So the first one I'm going to try is one called Tomatin. All right, so this is a lowland whiskey that was given to me by a friend of mine named Chris Diaz for his like bachelor party, I guess. And so this is a lowland whiskey that's very subtle, very smooth. Looking at the color, it's very light, kind of like a golden yellow kind of. And so we're going to swirl it around, and you can kind of take a look at the legs, and you wait for those droplets to come down. And there they are. And so it's dropping at about the usual rate that like most whiskeys are distilled at, which is about 40% by volume. So this is your standard run-of-the-mill strength. Some of them can go up to as high as like 65%, and that's called cask strength. And that stuff is powerful. It's really good. Typically not had with, as it is, it's not usually had straight. It's usually watered down a little bit or put in with an ice cube, because you're meant to, that's a little too much alcohol. It'll almost overwhelm how you taste and how you smell it. You kind of need to let it open up and breathe a little bit. But with this one, you don't need to. Some of you also notice that there's no ice in here. That's fine. You can have it with, well, you can say like on the rocks, or you can have it neat. However you want to drink, it's totally okay. Really, it's up to you, personal preference. But when it comes to like tasting something, generally, it might be a good idea to have it neat, just so you kind of get like an unadulterated or like a non-altered state. So off of the nose, so you take a quick sniff, exhale, then pass it to your nose again, and exhale again. And you can't, do this a couple of times, but as you keep going back to it with the nose, like you'll start to get a little tired of it, or like your nose will get used to it, and it'll be hard to detect anything new. So it's a good idea generally to pause a few seconds, like, okay, smell, okay, come back, think about what it smelled like, smell it again. Yeah, okay, that definitely smelled like what I thought it did. So in this case, I took a few notes beforehand, but to me, this smelled very sweet. It had kind of like a honey, dried fruit, kind of citrusy smell. And so it's very, very clean. There's not a whole lot of complexity to it. There's no overwhelming smoke. There's no spices. There's no briny sea saltiness to it. It's just a really, really pleasant smell. And so once you get like those nosing notes down, then you go and take your sip. So the way you do it is you smell, take it into your mouth, swirl it around a little bit, and then swallow as you exhale. And that'll help give you basically as much of the flavors as you possibly can out of it. So yeah, it's very nice. It's very light. Like I said, it does taste a lot like dried fruits, maybe a little bit like triple sec. It gets a kind of pastry sweet at the end, and then the finish on it, that's like how long the flavor stays in your mouth for, is nice. The last note I have in my mouth is honey. It's really tasty. There's no burn to it whatsoever. So this is something that, like, frankly, if you're having like a long day, or you just want something sweet but still kind of manly, right? Still whiskey, then I would go for something like that. Or it's also a great intro, like I said, to anybody who's brand new at it. So I'm actually going to finish this. That's pretty good. Usually lowland whiskeys get kind of a bad rap between those people that like it really, really smoky and peaty because they're jerks. There's nothing wrong with it, really. That's really nice. So, that was from the lowlands of Scotland. And so there's a bunch of different regions to it. So I brought a few out of my cabinet here to show you. So the next part would probably be something like this one, Dalwhinnie from the Highlands. It's like in the center of Scotland. That one has probably the most diverse range of characteristics. Some will be sweet, some will be more bitter, smoky, some will be more complex, like with spices, and that's kind of just characteristic of it being in the middle of everywhere. And then kind of on the opposite end of that are like the really malty, really sweet, spicy ones, the Speysides, like Macallan here. These ones will taste basically as if you were to take like a banana bread or like a fruitcake and like squeeze the juice out of it. Some of them are really, really tasty, and they happen to be some of my favorites. Next up, we have the Islands. So this one is from the farthest part north of Scotland, Highland Park. Those tend to be a little on the smoky side, not so much sweet, and they tend to have kind of a briny, salty character to them, so on the nose. And so they're interesting. They're not as powerful as the next group I'm going to show you, but they're for the kinds of people that kind of like a little bit of burn, a little bit of salt and pepper with their whiskey. And then the last one, the most famous one, is the Islay. So you might be familiar with Lagavulin 16. That's Ron Swanson's favorite. This is actually its 8-year-old little brother, Lagavulin 8. And so these ones, right on the nose, like right away, it smells like you fell into a bonfire, or kind of like if you wore like a sweater out at a campfire, and you're like, oh, I was at a campfire, because you smell it on your clothes. It's exactly the same thing. It's a little hard. Those are a little harder to get into the tasting too, because you kind of have to get past the smoke. And for a lot of people, it's just a boom, big smash of smoke flavor in their nose and in their on their palate, and that's all they can taste. But as you keep sipping it, as you get more used to it, you'll start to taste some of like the really nice flavors that develop underneath it. Typically stuff like I've even heard terms like vanilla ice cream, which is maybe a little optimistic, but it is still pretty nice. And so that's actually the next one that I'm going to try, just as kind of like a contrast. So if anybody who's following me, I'm going from lowland all the way to 180 degrees to the Islay, but I'm going to try a little bit of Lagavulin now. All right, so love that sound. So pour just a little bit in, and right away, like whereas the Tomatin was a little like golden yellow, this one is almost completely pale. But don't let that fool you, because right away on the nose, yeah, it smells like it's a barbecue fire going on. Yeah, and on the nose, that's pretty much all you're going to get out of it. I mean, you can keep smelling it a couple of times, but it's hard to really get anything past that. Maybe you'll get some stuff like I've heard like medicinal astringents, so kind of like almost like not rubbing alcohol, but like sterilized medical equipment. That's sort of like odd doctor's office smell. And so now we'll taste it. Yeah, so right away, yeah, the body on that was a really thick, almost oily kind of consistency. It was smoky, kind of like you had like some charred meat to it, but it doesn't go savory. It actually goes kind of sweet, like vanilla sweet. So it's a very, very complex whiskey. And on the exhale and on the finish, I get kind of a rubbery, like a sweet rubber, if that makes sense. Almost like you burnt sugar, and you put it like on a hot spatula or something like that. Like if you left your plastic spatula making cookies, and then you like kind of started to like eat it a little bit, like you shouldn't have. Tastes kind of like that. I really enjoy both. I haven't really found too many whiskeys that I don't like, and so you got a twofer plus a little bit of a lesson today. Like I said, I'll put